It was a crisp autumn morning when I decided to visit my grandparents' abandoned home. The house had stood empty for years, a relic of my childhood left to the mercy of time and nature. With the sun just peeking over the horizon, I made my way down the gravel path that led to the front door, the crunch of leaves underfoot echoing in the silent air. The house seemed to exhale a sigh of relief as I opened the creaky door, as though it had been waiting for someone to return. Dust motes danced in the slivers of sunlight that pierced through the grimy windows. Each room was a snapshot of a moment long past, frozen in time and layered with dust. I wandered through the house, memories flooding back with each creaking floorboard and familiar scent. It was in the attic, a place I had rarely ventured as a child, that I found the sextant. It was tucked away in an old wooden chest, buried beneath a pile of yellowed maps and brittle papers. The sextant was an exquisite piece of craftsmanship, its brass gleaming despite the years of neglect. Intricate engravings adorned its surface, and the lenses, though dusty, were intact. I couldn't recall ever seeing it before, and it struck me as odd that such a valuable object had been left behind. Curiosity piqued, I decided to take the sextant home with me. It felt heavy in my hand, a tangible link to a past I barely understood. That night, as I sat in my living room examining the sextant, a peculiar sensation washed over me. It was as if the room had grown colder, the air thick with a palpable tension. I dismissed it as my imagination and continued scrutinizing the device. As I adjusted the lenses, a low hum filled the room. It was so faint at first that I thought it was coming from outside, but as the sound grew louder, I realized it was emanating from the sextant itself. My heart pounded in my chest as the hum morphed into a series of rhythmic clicks and whispers, unintelligible but undeniably human. I set the sextant down, my hands trembling. The whispers ceased immediately, plunging the room into an eerie silence. I tried to rationalize what had just happened, convincing myself that the old device was merely malfunctioning. But deep down, I knew there was something more to it. That night, I was plagued by vivid nightmares. Dark figures loomed over me, their faces obscured by shadow, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. They spoke in hushed tones, their words indistinguishable but filled with menace. Each time I awoke, drenched in sweat, the sextant seemed to be closer to my bed, as if it had moved on its own. Days turned into weeks, and the strange occurrences intensified. Objects in my house would shift positions when I wasn't looking. Doors would creak open and shut of their own accord. The whispers became a constant presence, growing louder and more insistent with each passing day. I began to research the history of the sextant, desperate for answers. My search led me to an old maritime museum, where I learned that the sextant had once belonged to a notorious sea captain, rumored to have dabbled in the occult. He had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, his ship vanishing without a trace. The sextant had washed ashore years later, found clutched in the skeletal remains of a sailor. The curator's warning echoed in my mind as I left the museum. Some objects carry a curse, he had said, and they demand a price. That night, I decided to return the sextant to my grandparents' house. As I drove through the darkened streets, the whispers grew into a cacophony of screams. The air in the car became stifling, and I struggled to keep my focus on the road. Just as I reached the house, the screams stopped abruptly, replaced by an oppressive silence. I hurried inside, the sextant feeling like a lead weight in my hands. I placed it back in the chest and closed the lid, hoping that would be the end of it. As I turned to leave, a cold hand gripped my shoulder. I spun around, but there was no one there. The room was empty, save for the faint scent of salt water and the distant sound of waves crashing against a shore that didn't exist. I fled the house, vowing never to return. The nightmares ceased, and the whispers faded, but the memory of that night haunts me still. The sextant remains in the attic, a silent sentinel of the past, waiting for the next unwitting soul to uncover its dark secret.